The story of Lao Tzu begins in a mist that clings to the early centuries of Chinese history, a mist that blurs the line between myth and record, between a solitary sage and the collective yearning of a civilization in turmoil. Imagine the river valleys of the Central Plains, the Wei and the Yellow, where the clang of bronze weapons still echoed from the wars of the spring and autumn period, and where the weight of political decay pressed upon the shoulders of scholars, officials, and peasants alike. In that charged atmosphere, a figure emerged, whether a single man named Li whether a title, whether a tradition that would later be called Lao Tzu, who would pen a text of such paradoxical simplicity that it would reverberate through millennia. The Shiji, the grand historian Sima Qian's monumental chronicle, offers us the first glimpse of this enigmatic figure. Sima writes that Lao Tzu was a keeper of the archives, a man of great learning who, disillusioned by the corruption of the Zhou court, chose to withdraw from the world. He describes how the emperor, hearing of his wisdom, begged him to stay, and how Lao Tzu responded with a single enigmatic line, "The sage does not hoard, he lets all things return to the source." This brief passage, though terse, already sets the tone for the tension that would define Taoist thought. A tension between engagement and withdrawal, between the moral order of Confucian ritual and the fluid, unstructured flow of the Tao. Yet Sima Qian's account is not the only source that mentions Lao Tzu. The Zhuangzi, compiled a generation or two later, presents a series of dialogues that treat Lao Tzu as a foundational authority, a figure whose teachings are invoked to illustrate the limits of language and the boundlessness of the way. In one passage, Zhuangzhou recounts a conversation between Lao Tzu and a minister named Yin, where Lao Tzu says, "The Tao is like a bellows, it is empty yet never exhausted. The more it moves, the more it produces." This metaphor, vivid and concrete, reflects a worldview that sees the cosmos not as a hierarchy of ranks, but as an ever-renewing, self-generating process. The Zhuangzi also preserves a different anecdote about Lao Tzu's departure, one that adds layers of symbolic meaning to the more famous ox story. In this version, Lao Tzu is said to have left the capital on a night of heavy rain, his ox's hooves splashing through puddles that reflected the moon, while he recited verses that would later be bound into the Tao Te Ching. The rain, the moon, the ox, each element becomes an allegory for the Taoist principle of wu-wei, effortless action, and for the idea that true wisdom is found not in the loud proclamations of court officials, but in the quiet, rhythmic steps of a humble beast. The archaeological record, though silent on the name Lao Tzu, offers a complementary perspective. Excavations of warring states' tombs have uncovered bamboo strips bearing verses that parallel passages from the Tao Te Ching. One such find, the Mawangdui silk manuscripts, includes a version of chapter 33 that reads, "He who knows others is wise, he who knows himself is enlightened." The subtle variations in wording suggest that the text was circulating in multiple forms before it was finally canonized. Moreover, the material culture of the period, bronze mirrors inscribed with the character Tao, ritual vessels shaped like spiraling clouds, indicates a broader cosmological fascination with concepts of flow, transformation, and the unseen order that underlies the material world. These artifacts demonstrate that the philosophical seed that would become Daoism was already germinating in the intellectual soil of the warring states, nourished by debates over fate, virtue, and the proper organization of society. To understand why such a philosophy could take root, we must consider the political turbulence of the era. The Zhou dynasty, once the embodiment of the mandate of heaven, was fragmenting under the pressure of powerful feudal lords. The central authority weakened, and the once stable hierarchy gave way to a landscape of competing states, each seeking advantage through warfare, intrigue, and legal codification. In this environment, Confucianism offered a vision of moral rectitude, hierarchical relationships, and ritual propriety as the means to restore order. The Analects of Confucius emphasize Ren, humaneness, and Li, ritual, as the scaffolding for a harmonious society. Legalism, on the other hand, advocated strict laws and harsh punishments, arguing that human nature was fundamentally self-interested and that only an iron hand could maintain stability. The Han Fizi famously declares, "If the ruler wishes to command the people, he must make the law the supreme authority." Both of these schools, though divergent, share a common assumption. That order can be achieved through external structures, be they moral education or punitive codes. Daoism, as articulated in the Tao Te Ching and later expanded by Zhuangzi and Lizi, offers a striking contrast. Rather than imposing a rigid external order, Daoism invites a return to a primordial state of simplicity, a letting go of artificial distinctions, and an alignment with the natural rhythms that govern all things. The opening line of the Tao Te Ching, "The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name," immediately signals a philosophical posture that doubts the sufficiency of language, that doubts the capacity of human constructs to capture the underlying reality. In this sense, Taoism can be read as a response to the exhaustion of Confucian ritual and the brutality of legalist enforcement, a call to step back from the relentless striving for power, rank, and control, and to rediscover a path of wu-wei, non-action that is not passivity but a spontaneous, appropriate response to the circumstances of the moment. The narrative of Lao Tzu's departure on an ox provides a vivid illustration of this ethos. According to the Shiji, after a long career in the imperial archives, Lao Tzu grew weary of the court's moral decay. He decided to leave the capital, riding his ox westward toward the mountains. As the ox trudged along the dusty road, Lao Tzu is said to have turned to the emperor and whispered, "When the people are simple, the ruler is not needed." The emperor, struck by the profundity of the statement, begged Lao Tzu to stay, offering him riches and honors. Lao Tzu declined, and the ox continued its slow, steady march. The image of the ox, steady, patient, unhurried, becomes a living metaphor for the Taoist ideal, progress through natural, unforced movement, a journey that does not rush to a destination but follows the contours of the land. The ox's hooves striking the earth leave a subtle imprint, just as Taoist teachings leave a gentle, lasting influence on the consciousness of those who hear them. Equally evocative is the legend of the bamboo chest in which the Tao Te Ching was discovered. The story goes that as Lao Tzu rode his ox toward the western frontier, he passed a small village where a humble scholar named Yin held a chest of bamboo strips. Yin, recognizing the sage's presence, asked him to share his teachings. Lao Tzu, seeing the earnestness of the scholar, wrote his verses upon the bamboo, one line per strip, and placed them in the chest. He then handed the chest to Yin, instructing him to keep it safe. When Lao Tzu vanished into the mist, the scholar opened the chest and found a collection of 39 verses that would become the Tao Te Ching. This anecdote, while likely apocryphal, captures the Taoist reverence for simplicity, for the humble medium of bamboo, and for the transmission of wisdom through modest, tangible means rather than through grand monuments or imperial edicts. The bamboo, flexible yet sturdy, mirrors the Taoist principle that true strength lies in pliancy, that a reed that bends in the wind does not break. Beyond Lao Tzu, early Taoist thought was enriched by other voices, each adding nuance to the unfolding tradition. Lao Tzu, traditionally attributed to the eponymous sage Lai Yuku, compiled a text that blends philosophical discourse with mythic storytelling. In the Lao Tzu, the sage speaks of a great void that precedes the formation of heaven and earth, a concept that resonates with the later Taoist notion of Wu, non-being, as the source of all being. One passage reads, "The great void is the mother of all things, the mother is the source of the sun is the source of the grandsons, thus the world is ever flowing." This genealogical imagery of void mother-son underscores a cosmology that sees the universe as a continuous unfolding rather than a static hierarchy. Zhuangzhou, or Zhuangzi, pushes this further with his famous butterfly dream anecdote. "I, Zhuangzhou, once dreamed I was a butterfly, flitting about happily. I was not aware that I was Zhuangzhou. Suddenly I woke up, and there I was, Zhuangzhou again. But I did not know whether I was Zhuangzhou who had dreamed of being a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming that it was Zhuangzhou." This paradoxical story challenges the fixed boundaries between self and other, between reality and illusion, and invites listeners to consider the fluidity of identity, a core Taoist insight that the self is not a rigid, isolated entity, but a transformation within the larger Tao. Scholars have long debated the historicity of Lao Tzu, and modern sinology offers several compelling counterarguments. One line of critique points to the absence of contemporaneous references to Lao Tzu in the early annals of the Zhou court. If Lao Tzu had indeed served as an archivist, as Sima Qian claims, why do the bronze inscriptions and bamboo records of the period remain silent about his existence? Moreover, linguistic analysis of the Tao Te Ching reveals layers of textual development, suggesting that the work may have been compiled from multiple authors over several centuries. Some researchers argue that the Tao as a coherent philosophical system emerged only during the early Han Dynasty, when scholars sought to synthesize disparate strands of thought, legalist administrative techniques, Confucian moral teachings, and older shamanic cosmologies, into a unified doctrine that could serve the new imperial order. In this view, the Tao is not a primordial revelation, but a later intellectual synthesis, a retroactive attribution of a singular voice to a tradition that was, in fact, a collage of ideas. Another scholarly contention concerns the relationship between the Tao Te Ching and the I Ching, the ancient book of changes. The I Ching predates the Tao Te Ching and presents a cosmology based on the interplay of yin and yang, the 8 trigrams, and the concept of Tao as the underlying pattern of transformation. Some commentators, such as the early Han scholar Wang Bai, argue that the Tao Te Ching merely reframes the I Ching's cosmological principles in a more poetic, ethical language. For example, the Tao Te Ching's verse on the soft overcomes the hard echoes the I Ching's hexagram 5, which speaks of waiting and the gentle overcoming the rigid. This intertextuality suggests that Lao Tzu, or the compilers of his work, were deeply engaged with the existing divinatory tradition, adapting its symbols to articulate a philosophy of governance, personal conduct, and metaphysics. Yet other scholars, such as the modern philosopher Roger T. Ames, contend that while the I Ching provides a structural framework, the Tao Te Ching introduces a radical shift toward Wu Wei and a skepticism of moralizing language, thereby carving out a distinct philosophical space. The broader intellectual milieu of the Warring States period was a crucible of competing ideas, each vying for influence in a world where the old order was disintegrating. The Mosey School, for instance, advocated universal love and utilitarianism, arguing that the state should be organized around the maximization of collective benefit. The legalist thinkers such as Shang Yang and Han Fei emphasized codified law and statecraft. Meanwhile, the school of Yin-Yang, the Yangshi, explored cosmological theories based on the 5 phases: wood, fire, earth, metal, water, linking natural cycles to human affairs. In this vibrant tapestry, Taoist thought stands out for its emphasis on non-intervention and its poetic, almost mystical language. It does not seek to prescribe a specific political program. Rather, it offers a lens through which rulers and subjects alike might view the world as a flowing river, ever-changing, never fixed. Real-world applications of early Taoist ideas can be traced to the policies of certain Han emperors who, influenced by Taoist counsel, adopted a more hands-off approach to governance. Emperor Wen of Han, for example, is recorded as having reduced taxes, lowered forced labor, and encouraged a return to agrarian simplicity, policies that align with the Taoist principle of allowing the people to follow their natural rhythms. In the realm of medicine, the Taoist emphasis on balance and harmony informed the development of early Chinese medical theory, where concepts of qi, vital energy, and the interplay of yin and yang became foundational. The Huangdi Nijing, the Yellow Emperor's classic of medicine, reflects a Taoist worldview that health arises from aligning oneself with the natural flow of the cosmos, a notion that persists in practices such as acupuncture and Tai Chi. Modern interpretations of early Taoism continue to evolve, as scholars draw connections between ancient texts and contemporary philosophical debates. Some contemporary philosophers, like Graham Cooper, argue that the Tao Te Ching anticipates existentialist themes of authenticity and the absurd, noting that the text repeatedly urges individuals to shed artificial identities and embrace the spontaneous unfolding of life. Others, such as the environmental ethicist Holmes Ralston III, see Taoist reverence for natural processes as an early articulation of ecological humility, a reminder that human attempts to dominate nature often lead to unintended consequences. These modern readings demonstrate the enduring relevance of Lao Tzu's ambiguous verses, which can be reinterpreted to speak to issues ranging from political theory to environmental stewardship. Returning to the anecdotes that have shaped the mythic aura of Lao Tzu, we find in the story of his ox a powerful illustration of the Taoist principle of Zuren, naturalness. The ox, unassuming and patient, carries its master without complaint, moving at a pace dictated not by urgency but by the terrain. In a world obsessed with speed and conquest, the ox's measured stride invites us to consider the value of slowing down, of listening to the subtle cues of the environment. The second anecdote, the bamboo chest, underscores the Taoist reverence for modest means of transmission. Bamboo, a material that bends without breaking, becomes a metaphor for the flexibility of the Taoist sage, who adapts to circumstances without losing his essential nature. Both stories, though perhaps apocryphal, encapsulate the lived experience of Taoist philosophy, a call to align with the rhythm of the world, to value humility over grandeur, and to recognize that profound insight often arrives in the most unpretentious forms. The early Taoist thinkers did not merely echo each other, they offered distinct perspectives that enriched the tradition. Lizi's emphasis on the Great Void foregrounds a metaphysical foundation that resonates with later Taoist alchemical practices, where the practitioner seeks to return to a state of primordial emptiness. Zhuangzi's playful use of paradox and narrative, as seen in the Happy Fish dialogue, where Zhuangzi argues that he knows the fish are happy because he himself is a fish, demonstrates a radical epistemological humility, a willingness to admit the limits of human knowledge. This contrasts with the more concise, aphoristic style of the Tao Te Ching, which often presents its teachings as timeless, universal statements. Yet both share a common thread: a skepticism toward rigid categorization, a belief that the true nature of reality transcends binary oppositions. In evaluating the counterarguments, it is essential to recognize that the lack of concrete evidence for Lao Tzu's personal existence does not diminish the philosophical significance of the Tao Te Ching. Even if the text emerged from a collective of thinkers, the ideas it contains, non-action, humility, the ineffable source of all things, remain powerful. Moreover, the very process of attributing a singular author to a body of work reflects a human tendency to personify ideas, to give them a face and a story, thereby making them more accessible. The legend of Lao Tzu's departure, the image of the ox, the bamboo chest, these narratives serve as vessels that carry the philosophy across generations, allowing each new audience to find resonance in the ancient words. Cross-referencing the I Ching further illuminates the intellectual environment in which Daoism took shape. The I Ching's hexagrams, each composed of 6 broken or unbroken lines, embody the dynamic interplay of yin and yang, the constant flux that Daoism celebrates. The Tao Te Ching's opening verses echo this sense of perpetual transformation. All things arise from the one arises from the void. The notion of a void, a fertile emptiness, parallels the I Ching's concept of wu, the undifferentiated ground from which all patterns emerge. Yet while the I Ching offers a divinatory framework for decision-making, the Tao Te Ching advises a more passive stance, suggesting that the wise ruler should align with the natural order rather than attempt to manipulate it. This subtle divergence underscores how Taoist thought both draws from and departs from earlier cosmological ideas, carving out a distinctive philosophical niche. The historical canvas of early Taoism is also colored by the political realities of the period. As the Zhou dynasty's authority waned, the emerging states sought new legitimizing narratives. Confucian scholars emphasized the restoration of ancient rites, legalists promoted the strength of law, while Taoist thinkers offered an alternative vision: that the ruler's legitimacy derived not from force or ritual, but from his ability to embody the Tao, to become a conduit for the natural flow of the world. In this sense, the Tao Te Ching's counsel to go back to the root can be read as a political strategy, a reminder that overreaching authority disrupts the harmony of the realm, leading to rebellion and chaos. The early Taoist emphasis on simplicity and frugality, therefore, can be understood as both a personal ethic and a subtle critique of the extravagance and corruption that plagued the courts of the time. Historical anecdotes further illuminate this dynamic. One tale recounts how the Qin dynasty's first emperor, Shi Huangdi, consulted a Taoist hermit named Giguzi about the best way to consolidate his power. The hermit replied, "A ruler who seeks to dominate the world will find his empire crumble like a house of cards in the wind." Though the emperor dismissed the counsel, the story illustrates the tension between the legalist drive for absolute control and the Taoist warning against overextension. Another anecdote involves the Han minister Li Wen, who, fascinated by Taoist alchemical texts, attempted to create an elixir of immortality. His failure and subsequent exile served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of seeking transcendence through external means rather than cultivating inner alignment with the Tao. These stories, while sometimes embellished, reflect the real-world interplay between Taoist ideas and political power, showing how the philosophy was both a source of inspiration and a subtle instrument of critique. The influence of early Taoist thought extended beyond the political sphere into the arts and literature. Poets of the later Han and Tang dynasties, such as Tao Yunaming and Li Bai, drew upon Taoist imagery to express a yearning for retreat from worldly concerns. Tao Yunaming's famous line, "I built a cottage by the eastern hill, and there I live in peace, far from the bustling market," echoes the Taoist ideal of withdrawing into nature to live in harmony with the Tao. Li Bai's verses, replete with references to wandering clouds and flowing rivers, embody the Taoist celebration of spontaneity and the fleeting nature of existence. These literary works demonstrate how the early philosophical foundations laid by Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, and Lizi permeated Chinese culture, shaping aesthetic sensibilities and personal aspirations for centuries to come. In contemporary scholarship, the debate over Lao Tzu's historicity continues to evolve. Some researchers employ stylometric analysis, statistical examination of word usage and sentence structure, to compare the Tao Te Ching with other contemporaneous texts. Their findings suggest a high degree of linguistic cohesion within the Tao Te Ching itself, supporting the hypothesis that it may have been composed by a single author or a tightly knit group. Others argue that the presence of multiple layers of commentary, such as the Tao Piu tradition, indicates that the text was subject to ongoing reinterpretation, reflecting a living tradition rather than a static, authorial artifact. Regardless of the methodological conclusions, the central insight remains. The Tao Te Ching's power lies not in the certainty of its provenance, but in the depth of its resonance. To conclude this exploration of the historical canvas, we must remember that the story of Lao Tzu and early Daoism is a mosaic, assembled from fragments of history, myth, archaeology, and philosophical inquiry. The Shiji provides a narrative foundation, the Zhuangzi offers interpretive depth, the bamboo strips of Mawangdui give us textual evidence, the ox and the bamboo chest give us symbolic memory. The I Ching supplies a cosmological backdrop, and the political turbulence of the warring states supplies the crucible in which these ideas were forged. Each piece, each anecdote, each counterargument adds texture to our understanding, inviting us to sit quietly, as the sage might have, and contemplate the flowing river of thought that has carried Lao Tzu's words across 2,500 years. In the hush between sentences, in the pause after a profound line, we find the space that Daoism cherishes, a space where the Tao can be felt, if not fully named, and where the wisdom of the past can gently guide us toward a more harmonious present. What if the most profound wisdom were not a doctrine to be argued, but a quiet current that runs beneath the surface of every moment? Lao Tzu invites us to listen to that current, to sense a way of being that is less about doing and more about allowing. In the opening chapters of the Tao Te Ching, we encounter three pillars that have shaped Chinese thought for millennia. The ineffable Tao, the cultivated virtue of Ti, and the practice of Wu Wei, often rendered as non-action. To understand these concepts, we must first turn to the text itself, to the ancient verses that have been translated and retranslated across centuries, each rendering a faint echo of a meaning that refuses to be pinned down. The first verse, the most quoted, begins with the paradox that defines the whole work. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. DC. Lao's scholarly rendering preserves the tension. The way that can be spoken of is not the constant way. The name that can be named is not the constant name. Stephen Mitchell, by contrast, offers a poetic brevity. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. Notice how each translation preserves the idea that the ultimate principle eludes conceptual capture. The Tao is not a thing we can point to on a map, nor a doctrine we can seal in a treaty. It is a process, a flow, a way of ordering that is always already moving beyond the limits of language. When Lao Tzu says the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao, he is not denying the value of language. Rather, he is highlighting its relational nature. Language, like any tool, works by drawing boundaries, by distinguishing one thing from another. The Tao, however, is the ground of all distinctions. It is the source from which the very possibility of naming arises, yet it remains untouched by the act of naming. This insight resonates with the later Buddhist notion of sunyata, emptiness, which teaches that phenomena are empty of inherent existence precisely because they are interdependently designated. Both traditions converge on the idea that the ultimate is a relational web, not a static substance. In verse 2, Lao Tzu deepens the relational insight. When people see some things as beautiful, other things become ugly. When they see some things as good, other things become bad. Lao translates this as, when people see the beautiful, they also see the ugly. When they see the good, they also see the bad. Mitchell's version reads, when people look at a thing as beautiful, they see another thing as ugly. When they look at a thing as good, they see another thing as bad. Here the Tao is expressed not as a metaphysical principle, but as the pattern of interdependence that makes opposites possible. The moment we label one phenomenon as beautiful, we create its counterpart, ugly. The very act of differentiation is the Tao at work. This relationality is not a logical dualism, but a fluid dance, a constant shifting of perspective that prevents any fixed hierarchy. The third verse introduces the concept of Ti, often translated as virtue or inner power. The Tao gives birth to one, says the text. One gives birth to two, two gives birth to three, three gives birth to the 10,000 things. Lao's translation continues, the Tao gives birth to one. One gives birth to two, two gives birth to three, three gives birth to the 10,000 things. Mitchell condenses it, the Tao gives birth to all things, the 10,000 things have a beginning. The one is the Tao itself, the two are yin and yang, the three is the synthesis that yields the myriad forms. Ti then is the manifested virtue that arises when the Tao is allowed to express itself through the world. It is not a moral code imposed from above, but the natural efficacy that follows from aligning with the underlying flow. To bring these abstractions into everyday life, imagine a gardener tending a bamboo grove. The gardener does not pull at each shoot, forcing it to grow in a straight line. Instead, she prepares the soil, ensures the water drains properly, and then steps back, allowing the bamboo to rise according to its own rhythm. The gardener's skill lies not in exerting control, but in creating conditions, light, moisture, space, that enable the plants to express their innate vigor. This is Wu Wei in practice, non-forcing, non-coercive, yet profoundly effective. The gardener's action is guided by an awareness of the teak rhythm of growth, and the resulting harvest is an expression of tea, the cultivated virtue of the garden. Consider also a leader of a small community, perhaps a village elder who must guide his people through a season of drought. Rather than issuing edicts demanding that every household store a fixed amount of grain, he convenes a council, listens to the concerns of the farmers, and subtly adjusts the communal storage policies, allowing flexibility for those who have surplus and those who have less. He does not command, he does not micromanage. His restraint creates a space where the community can collectively adapt, where the natural generosity of the land is respected. The elder's guidance is an embodiment of Wu Wei. He intervenes only enough to keep the system balanced, trusting the people's capacity to respond. The resulting harmony is tea, the virtue that emerges when leadership is attuned to the Tao. Yet not everyone has embraced this notion of effortless action. A common critique, especially from modern Western political thought, is that Wu Wei encourages passivity, that it could be used to justify inaction in the face of injustice. The argument goes, if one is to do nothing, how can one confront oppression, climate crisis, or systemic inequality? Critics point to the potential danger of interpreting non-action as a license for complacency. To address this, we must return to the text. In verse 48, Lao Tzu writes, "In the pursuit of learning, the teacher is the best. In the pursuit of virtue, the master is the best." The Taoist master is not a detached observer. He is engaged, but his engagement is calibrated. Wu Wei is not the absence of action, but the avoidance of forced, artificial action. It is the difference between imposing a solution from a place of ego and allowing a solution to arise from the conditions that one has helped shape. A modern parallel can be found in the work of environmental activist Vandana Shiva, who cultivates seed sovereignty, not by mandating what farmers must plant, but by creating seed banks and sharing knowledge, thereby enabling communities to act from a place of empowerment rather than coercion. A second counter-argument arises from linguistic relativism. Some scholars argue that the Tao is merely a poetic device, a metaphorical shorthand for the way things happen, and that its mystic aura is a later accretion. They contend that the Tao functions as a rhetorical strategy, a way for Lao Tzu to critique the political turbulence of his era without naming any concrete institution. If the Tao is only a linguistic construct, does it retain any philosophical weight? The answer, we might say, lies in the way language itself participates in the formation of reality. When Lao Tzu says the name that can be named is not the eternal name, he is already pointing to the limits of linguistic capture. The Tao is both a word and a pointer to the ineffable, a reminder that every name is a provisional map, not the territory. In this sense, the Tao functions like Heidegger's concept of Gelassenheit, a letting be that acknowledges the concealment of being. Heidegger, in Being and Time, writes of the clearing where beings can appear, yet he cautions that any attempt to fix that clearing into a concept will close it off. Lao Tzu's poetic device thus becomes a methodological tool. By naming the limits of naming, he opens a space for the unnameable to surface. Historical anecdotes help us see how these ideas moved from abstract verses to lived practice. In the early Zhou dynasty, King Wen, a ruler renowned for his moral rectitude, convened scholars at his court to discuss governance. Legend tells that when a minister suggested a harsh tax to fund a military campaign, King Wen responded, "The people are like water. If we dam them, they will overflow. If we guide them gently, they will flow." This response mirrors the Taoist principle of Wu Wei, governing not by forceful imposition, but by shaping conditions that allow the populace to move naturally toward the common good. King Wen's approach, though not directly attributed to Lao Tzu, demonstrates the permeation of Taoist sensibility into early political thought, a sensibility that would later be codified in the Tao Te Ching. Another vivid story concerns the legendary inventor of the water wheel, Du Shi, who lived during the Eastern Han. Du Shi observed a river's steady current, and rather than attempting to stop it, designed a wheel that harnessed its flow to power a bellows for iron smelting. He did not force the water to move against its direction. He aligned his technology with the teak principle of working with the natural order. The water wheel became a symbol of how human ingenuity can embody Wu Wei, creating tools that amplify rather than resist the underlying dynamics of nature. The anecdote illustrates how the Taoist ideal can inform engineering, economics, and even environmental stewardship. Let us return to the textual core. In verse 5, Lao Tzu writes, "Heaven and earth are impartial. They treat all things like straw dogs." The translation by Lao reads, "Heaven and earth are impartial. They treat all things as if they were straw dogs." Mitchell renders it, "Heaven and earth are impartial. They treat all things like straw dogs." The image of a straw dog, a ceremonial object that is revered for its role and then discarded, serves as a reminder that the Tao does not favor any particular outcome. It is a cosmic impartiality that encourages humility. When we see ourselves as central, we miss the larger pattern. This impartiality is echoed in the Buddhist teaching that all conditioned things are impermanent, all emotions are fleeting, all phenomena are empty. The Tao, like emptiness, is not a nihilistic void, but a spacious openness that allows forms to arise and dissolve without attachment. Verse 12 offers a practical illustration of Wu Wei through the metaphor of the uncarved block. The 5 colors blind the eye, the 5 tones deafen the ear, the 5 flavors dull the taste. Lao's translation continues, "The 5 colors cause the eyes to be confused. The 5 sounds cause the ears to be confused. The 5 flavors cause the tongue to be confused." Mitchell says, "The 5 colors blind the eye, the 5 sounds deafen the ear, the 5 flavors dull the taste." Here Lao Tzu warns against the overstimulating excesses of civilization, luxury, music, gastronomy, that distract us from the simple, unadorned state of the uncarved block, Pu. The Pu is a metaphor for original simplicity, a state of readiness to be shaped by the Tao without preconception. A modern parallel can be found in the minimalist movement, where designers strip away superfluous ornamentation to reveal the essential function of an object, allowing the user to engage with it directly, without the interference of decorative noise. The notion of tea as cultivated virtue can be seen in verse 27, where Lao Tzu says, "A good traveler has no fixed plans and is not afraid of the unknown." Lao translates, "A good traveler has no fixed plans and does not fear the unknown." Mitchell's version reads, "A good traveler has no fixed plans and is not afraid of the unknown." The traveler's competence lies not in a rigid itinerary, but in an adaptable presence, an embodiment of tea that arises from trust in the teak flow. This image resonates with the existentialist emphasis on authenticity. The traveler is authentic not because he follows a predetermined script, but because he remains open to the unfolding path. To bring these ideas into the realm of contemporary leadership, think of a tech startup founder who resists micromanaging the product roadmap. Instead, she builds a culture where engineers experiment, where failures are treated as data points rather than moral failings. By stepping back, she creates an environment where innovation emerges organically. The founder's restraint is a modern expression of Wu Wei, and the resulting breakthroughs are the tea of the organization, an emergent virtue that could not have been scripted in a boardroom memo. When we compare Lao Tzu's non-action to Heidegger's concept of Gelassenheit, we find a striking resonance. Heidegger describes Gelassenheit as a releasement toward being, a letting be that allows things to reveal themselves in their own time. He writes, "We must let the world be and not try to dominate it." This is not a call to passivity, but a call to attentiveness, to a mode of engagement that respects the autonomy of being. Lao Tzu's Wu Wei operates on a similar principle. The sage does not impose his will, but aligns his will with the Tao, thereby allowing the world to unfold. Both philosophers warn against the hubris of total control, suggesting that true power lies in the capacity to step aside. The Buddhist doctrine of emptiness further deepens our understanding of the Tao's relational nature. Sunyata teaches that phenomena lack an independent, self-existent essence. They arise dependent on causes and conditions. This interdependence mirrors the Taoist observation that the 10,000 things are born of the one. In both traditions, the ultimate reality is a dynamic web, not a static substance. When Lao Tzu says, "The Tao is the source of all things," it is the mother of the 10,000 things. He is articulating a vision of the world as a continuous process of arising and ceasing, a view that anticipates the Buddhist middle way between eternalism and nihilism. Let us explore another verse that illuminates the relational aspect of language. Verse 22 states, "If you do not trust yourself, you will not be trusted." Lao translates, "If you do not trust yourself, you will not be trusted by others." Mitchell offers, "If you do not trust yourself, you will not be trusted." This succinct line captures the feedback loop between inner alignment and outer relationships. Trust in the Taoist sense is not a contractual assurance but an expression of tea, a confidence that stems from being in harmony with the Tao. When a person cultivates inner steadiness, the world responds in kind because the teak flow rewards authenticity. This insight resonates with the modern psychological research on self-efficacy, which shows that individuals who trust their own judgments are more likely to inspire trust in others. The Taoist perspective on language also informs contemporary debates in philosophy of language. The relativists claim that the Tao is merely a poetic device can be countered by noting that the Tao functions as a performative utterance. By naming the ineffable, Lao Tzu does not merely describe a concept, he enacts a shift in the listener's orientation. The utterance invites the audience to suspend the habitual habit of categorization, to experience a moment of silence that precedes conceptual thought. In this way, the Tao operates like a koan in Zen practice, a paradoxical statement that is not meant to be solved intellectually, but to destabilize ordinary cognition, opening a space for direct insight. Now let us revisit the gardener metaphor, this time with a focus on seasonal change. In early spring, a gardener observes the first shoots pushing through the thawing soil. Rather than pulling the seedlings to a uniform height, she places a simple bamboo stake and allows the shoots to coil naturally around it, guiding their growth without constraining it. As the season progresses, the shoots become sturdy, their stems thickening in response to the gentle support. The gardener's hand is light, her intervention minimal, yet the garden flourishes. This is Wu Wei embodied. The gardener does not force the plants to grow in a predetermined shape. She creates a context that encourages the plants to express their own innate form. The resulting harvest is an expression of tea, the garden's cultivated virtue, which is not imposed but emerges from the harmonious interplay between soil, water, light, and the gardener's mindful presence. Similarly, consider a city planner tasked with revitalizing a decaying waterfront. Instead of imposing a rigid master plan that dictates every building's height and use, the planner engages local residents, artists, and entrepreneurs, listening to their visions for the space. He then designates a flexible zoning framework that allows mixed-use development, public art installations, and community gardens to sprout organically. The waterfront evolves as a tapestry of diverse interventions, each reflecting the community's evolving needs. The planner's role is not to command a single aesthetic, but to nurture an environment where creativity can arise, a modern illustration of Wu Wei in urban design. The resulting vibrancy is tea, the collective virtue that the city manifests when its policies are attuned to the lived realities of its inhabitants. We must also acknowledge the paradox that lies at the heart of Lao Tzu's teaching. The more we try to grasp the Tao, the more it slips away. In verse 52, the text declares, "The world does not exist before the Tao does not exist before the world." Lao translates, "The world does not exist before the Tao. The Tao does not exist before the world." Mitchell offers, "The world is not before the Tao is not before the world." This circularity underscores that the Tao is both the condition of existence and the result of existence, a feedback loop that defies linear causality. Such a view anticipates contemporary systems theory, which sees ecosystems as self-organizing networks where parts and wholes co-define each other. The modern philosopher Bruno Latour, in his actor network theory, argues that objects, humans, and ideas co-constitute each other in a network of relations. This resonates with Lao Tzu's observation that the 10,000 things are born of the one, and that the one gives birth to two, two gives birth to three. The one can be read as the relational field that precedes and sustains the network, while the two, yin and yang, represent the polarities that generate dynamic tension, and the three as the emergent synthesis that gives rise to the manifold world. By seeing the world as a web of mutual becoming, we honor both the ancient Taoist insight and the contemporary scientific understanding of complex adaptive systems. In practice, the principle of Wu Wei can be a guide for conflict resolution. Imagine a mediator in a labor dispute who refrains from imposing a top-down settlement. Instead, the mediator creates a neutral space, clarifies the shared interests, job security, fair wages, dignity, and then steps back, allowing the parties to negotiate from a place of mutual respect. The mediator's restraint does not equate to indifference. It is a strategic non-action that empowers the participants to discover their own solution. The eventual agreement, reached through dialogue rather than decree, is a manifestation of Ti, the virtue of harmonious cooperation. To deepen our appreciation of the Tao's relational nature, let us examine the metaphor of water that recurs throughout the Tao Te Ching. In verse 8, Lao Tzu writes, "The highest good is like water. Water benefits all things and does not compete." Lao renders it, "The highest good is like water. Water benefits all things without trying to compete." Mitchell's version states, "The highest good is like water. Water benefits all things and does not compete." Water's softness allows it to flow into the lowest places, yet it can erode the hardest rock over time. Its non-assertive nature is precisely why it can achieve great influence. A modern illustration can be found in the practice of restorative justice, where the aim is not to punish, but to restore relationships through listening and empathy, qualities that echo water's gentle yet persistent capacity to heal. The water metaphor also informs ecological thinking. In climate activism, the principle of working with nature encourages solutions that amplify natural processes, such as restoring wetlands to absorb floodwaters, rather than building massive concrete levees that merely redirect the flow. By aligning human interventions with the teak logic of water, we create solutions that are sustainable and resilient, embodying tea in the realm of environmental stewardship. Now let us turn to a more subtle aspect of Lao Tzu's thought, the idea that the sage's power lies in not acting. In verse 64, the text says, "A great nation is like a low bowl. The people are like the water that fills it." Lao translates, "A great nation is like a low bowl. Its people are like water that fills it." Mitchell writes, "A great nation is like a low bowl. Its people are like water that fills it." The low bowl is humble, receptive, and spacious enough to accommodate the flow of water. A ruler who cultivates humility creates a polity that can absorb the currents of change without breaking. The metaphor warns against the hubris of a high bowl that spills over when faced with excess. In contemporary terms, this can be seen in corporate cultures that value flat hierarchies and open communication, allowing ideas to flow freely rather than being constrained by rigid top-down structures. The notion of humility as a strategic advantage is echoed in Sun Tzu's Art of War, where he advises, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." Both texts advocate a form of power that is indirect, that works by shaping conditions rather than by brute force. The convergence of these ideas across Chinese strategic thought suggests a broader cultural appreciation for the efficacy of non-coercive influence. When we examine the Tao Te Ching alongside the Analects of Confucius, we notice a tension that has animated Chinese philosophy for centuries. Confucius emphasizes ritual, propriety, and moral cultivation through prescribed duties. Lao Tzu, by contrast, urges a return to spontaneous virtue, an inner alignment that transcends external forms. Yet both philosophers agree on the centrality of Ren, humaneness, and on the importance of cultivating the self. The difference lies in method. Confucianism proposes a structured path of self-cultivation through education and ritual, while Taoism proposes an unstructured path of attunement to the natural order. The dialogue between these traditions enriches our understanding of virtue as both a cultivated practice and an emergent quality. Let us revisit the water wheel anecdote, now focusing on its symbolic resonance. Duxi's invention did not merely harness kinetic energy, it embodied the principle that technology, at its best, works with the Tao. The wheel turned because the river's flow was already present, the wheel merely provided a conduit. This is a lesson for modern engineers who wrestle with the challenge of integrating renewable energy into existing grids. By designing systems that complement natural cycles, solar panels that store excess light in batteries, wind turbines that adjust blade pitch in response to gusts, we practice a form of wu-wei that respects the planetary Tao. The resulting infrastructure is not an imposition upon nature, but a partnership that reflects tea in the realm of technology. In contemporary psychotherapy, the concept of acceptance and commitment mirrors Taoist non-action. Therapists encourage clients to observe thoughts without trying to suppress them, to allow feelings to arise and pass like clouds in the sky. This therapeutic stance is not passive resignation. It is an active cultivation of awareness that aligns with the teak flow of experience. The client's growth, psychological tea, emerges when they stop forcing a particular narrative and instead allow their lived reality to unfold. The Taoist view of language also informs modern semiotics. Ferdinand de Saussure argued that the sign is arbitrary, that meaning arises from relational differences within a system. Lao Tzu's warning that the name that can be named is not the eternal name anticipates this insight. Names are not intrinsic to the things they denote, they are conventional markers within a network of differences. By recognizing the provisional nature of symbols, we become less attached to rigid conceptual frameworks, opening ourselves to the fluidity that the Tao embodies. Returning to the verse on the uncarved block, we can see a parallel in contemporary design thinking. The concept of minimum viable product encourages creators to launch with the simplest functional version, then iterate based on user feedback. This approach respects the teak principle of beginning with the uncarved block, an open, unshaped potential, allowing the product to evolve organically rather than being over-engineered from the outset. The resulting adaptability is a form of tea, the cultivated virtue of responsiveness. Let us also consider the ethical dimension of wu-wei. In the realm of medical practice, the principle of primum non nocere, first, do no harm, aligns with the Taoist injunction to act without forcing. A physician who respects the body's innate capacity for healing, intervening only when necessary, exemplifies non-action that is nonetheless profoundly caring. This balance of intervention and restraint reflects the Taoist ethic of compassionate non-interference, a stance that modern bioethics continues to explore. When we examine the Taoist notion of emptiness alongside the Buddhist concept of sunyata, we see a shared recognition that the ground of being is not a substantial entity, but a space of potential. In the Tao Te Ching, emptiness is not a void of nothingness, but a fertile openness that allows forms to arise. Lao Tzu writes, "We shape clay into a pot, but it is the emptiness inside that makes the vessel useful." This line, rendered by Lao as, "We shape a vessel out of clay, but it is the empty space within that makes the vessel useful," and by Mitchell as, "We shape a pot from clay, but it is the emptiness inside that makes it useful," captures the paradox that utility derives from what is not there. This insight informs modern physics, where the vacuum is not empty, but teeming with quantum fluctuations that give rise to particles. The Taoist appreciation of the productive power of emptiness anticipates these scientific discoveries, suggesting that the ancient text is not merely mystical poetry, but a profound observation of the dynamics of existence. To bring these threads together, consider a modern organization that adopts a lean methodology. The lean approach seeks to eliminate waste, to streamline processes, and to empower frontline workers to make decisions. By reducing bureaucratic layers, the organization practices wu-wei. It refrains from imposing excessive controls, allowing the natural flow of information and initiative to surface. The resulting agility and quality improvement are manifestations of Ti, the cultivated virtue of the organization. This example illustrates how ancient Taoist principles can be operationalized in contemporary management practice. In sum, the core concepts of Tao Te and Wu Wei form an interlocking triad that invites us to see reality as a relational tapestry, to cultivate virtue not by imposing rigid standards, but by aligning with the underlying flow, and to act in a way that is both effective and unobtrusive. The textual analysis of verses 1, 2, 5, 12, 22, 27, 52, 64, and others shows how Lao Tzu weaves language, paradox, and metaphor to point beyond the limits of conceptual thought. The historical anecdotes of King Wen's gentle governance and Du Shi's water wheel illustrate how these ideas have been lived out in concrete contexts. The counter-arguments, whether accusing wu-wei of passivity or reducing the Tao to a poetic device, invite us to sharpen our understanding, to see that non-action is not inaction, and that the Tao is not merely a linguistic trick, but a methodological invitation to experience the unnameable. By cross-referencing Heidegger's letting be, Buddhist emptiness, Lao Tzu's actor network theory, and modern practices in design, leadership, ecology, and psychotherapy, we see that Lao Tzu's insights reverberate across cultures and centuries. The garden, the water wheel, the leader, the therapist, all become illustrations of a single principle, that true power lies in the capacity to create conditions where the world can express its own wisdom. When we cultivate humility, when we trust the flow, when we refrain from forcing outcomes, we embody the Tao, we manifest Ti, and we practice wu-wei. In doing so, we join a lineage of thinkers and practitioners who have learned across time that the most profound action is often the quietest, and that the deepest wisdom is the one that lets itself be. The Tao the Way is often described as the river that runs beneath the surface of all things, shaping the landscape without ever demanding attention. When Lao Tzu turns his attention from the natural world to the realm of human affairs, he offers a vision of ethics and governance that is at once startlingly simple and profoundly subversive. He writes, "The greatest virtue is to empty the heart, to fill the mind with nothing, to let the people return to simplicity." In these few lines, we find the seed of a political philosophy that asks not how to command, but how to step back, how to create a space in which people can be themselves, unburdened by the heavy expectations of ambition, rank, and force. To understand this ethical landscape, we must first locate it within the broader intellectual currents of early China. The period in which Lao Tzu is traditionally placed, the twilight of the spring and autumn era, was a time of fractured states, incessant warfare, and a desperate search for order. Confucius was offering a blueprint for moral cultivation based on rights and hierarchical relationships. The legalists were proposing a system of strict laws and rewards, a kind of iron fist to hold the kingdom together. The Mohists were advocating universal love as a remedy for conflict. Lao Tzu, by contrast, turned away from the spectacle of power and suggested that the most effective ruler is one who governs by emptying hearts, who does not interfere, who allows things to take their natural course. The ideal ruler in the Tao Te Ching is not a charismatic leader who rallies the masses, but a quiet steward who clears the ground for the sprouts of humility and simplicity to grow. In chapter 17, Lao Tzu says, "When the best ruler is dead, the people do not know he ever lived." This paradoxical statement is an invitation to consider a form of political humility that is almost invisible. It is a humility that does not simply mean modesty in speech, but a willingness to relinquish the very desire to dominate. The ruler's power in this view is measured not by the number of edicts he issues, but by the degree to which he can let the people's hearts be empty of greed, fear, and ambition, and their minds be free of the clutter of unnecessary desire. To see this philosophy in action, we can turn to the reign of Emperor Wen of the Han Dynasty, who ruled from 180 to 157 BCE. Wen, known posthumously as the Emperor of Benevolence, is often praised for his policies that echo Lao Tzu's counsel. He reduced taxes, cut back on corvée labor, and famously said, "If the people are content, the state will be strong." He also practiced a form of non-intervention, in the sense that he refrained from imposing grand building projects or elaborate court ceremonies that would drain the treasury and burden the populace. In his own words recorded in the Book of Han, Wen declared, "I shall govern by the empty, not by the full. I shall lead by the unspoken, not by the spoken." This self-effacing stance allowed the economy to recover after the tumult of the preceding Qin dynasty, and it fostered a period of relative peace and prosperity. The simplicity of Wen's governance, light taxation, minimal bureaucracy, a focus on agricultural stability, mirrored the Taoist emphasis on returning to the root. A second, more distant, illustration comes from the Tang dynasty, a period often celebrated for its cultural flourishing and cosmopolitan openness. Yet beneath the glittering court, there were moments when Tang emperors deliberately invoked Taoist principles to temper the excesses of imperial power. Emperor Xuanzang in the early 8th century issued a series of edicts that limited the size of the imperial household, reduced the number of official examinations, and encouraged officials to practice quietude and non-action, wu wei, in their administrative duties. The famed poet official Li Bai, himself a devotee of Taoist thought, wrote, "The great river runs its course without hurry. The ruler should be like the river, unhurried and unobtrusive." These policies were not merely rhetorical. They manifested in concrete actions, such as the reduction of forced labor for public works and the promotion of local self-governance in frontier regions. The result was a temporary easing of central authority, allowing local communities to manage their own affairs with minimal interference, a living embodiment of the Taoist ideal of governing by emptying hearts. When we compare these historical episodes with the Confucian model of meritocratic bureaucracy, a stark contrast emerges. Confucianism places the moral cultivation of the ruler at the center of good governance, but it does so through a system of rigorous education, examinations, and the performance of ritual propriety. The Confucian ruler is expected to be a moral exemplar, a junzi who leads by virtue and by the example of proper conduct. This model, while elevating moral development, still presumes an active, directive role for the state in shaping citizens' behavior. Lao Tzu's approach, in contrast, suggests that the most effective moral cultivation occurs when the state steps back, allowing individuals to discover virtue through their own unforced alignment with the natural order. Legalist thought, on the other hand, advocates a starkly opposite method. A ruler must enforce strict laws, reward compliance, and punish deviation with an iron hand. The legalist view sees human nature as fundamentally self-interested and therefore requires external coercion to maintain order. Lao Tzu's counsel that the softest thing in the world overcomes the hardest, chapter 43, directly challenges this premise, proposing instead that the gentle, the yielding, can achieve what force cannot, lasting harmony without the need for punitive measures. These divergent pathways raise an essential question: can a philosophy of non-domination truly sustain a complex modern state? Modern political theorists have taken up this challenge, and their critiques fall into two broad camps. The first camp, represented by scholars such as John Rawls and Amartya Sen, argues that Lao Tzu's political advice is essentially utopian, an elegant but impractical ideal that cannot address the concrete demands of justice, distribution, and rights in a pluralistic society. Rawls, in his theory of justice, emphasizes the necessity of a well-ordered society built upon fair institutions and public reason, structures that seem at odds with a ruler who does not intervene. Sen, focusing on capabilities, would ask how the Taoist model ensures that individuals have the substantive freedoms to pursue their own conception of the good life, rather than simply being left to empty themselves in a way that could be co-opted by those in power. The second camp, more skeptical of the Taoist vision, suggests that the call for non-intervention can be twisted into a covert justification for autocracy. The argument goes that a ruler who claims to empty hearts might simply suppress dissent by presenting it as a natural order, thereby silencing opposition under the guise of non-action. Political philosopher Michael Sandel, in his Discussions of Civic Virtue, warns that a philosophy that downplays the role of active civic engagement can erode the public sphere, leaving citizens passive and vulnerable to manipulation. He points to historical instances where non-action was used as a pretext for neglect, allowing corruption to fester behind an ostensibly benevolent facade. In response to these critiques, we can look back at the lived experience of Tao Te, the 6th-century poet-scholar whose life offers a vivid anecdote about the tension between public service and personal integrity. Tao Te, also known as Tao Qian, was offered several high-ranking positions in the Jin court, yet each time he declined, citing the noisy world and the burdens of officialdom. In his famous poem, Returning to the Fields, he writes, "I have long been weary of the bustle of the capital. I will return to my thatched cottage and plow the fields, where the wind and the rain are my companions." His withdrawal can be read not as a defeatist retreat, but as an embodiment of the Taoist ethic of simplicity and humility. By choosing a life of modest farming over the trappings of power, Tao Te demonstrated that true governance may sometimes be exercised through the act of non-participation, allowing the state to function without the corrosive influence of personal ambition. His example resonates with Lao Tzu's warning that the wise ruler does not dominate the people, he lets them be themselves. Yet the story of Tao Te also serves as a cautionary tale. When the court later appointed his son to a minor post, the family was drawn back into the political vortex, illustrating how the pull of the state can be relentless. This anecdote reminds us that the Taoist ideal of withdrawal is not a permanent escape, but a strategic, conscious choice to preserve one's inner simplicity in the face of external pressure. It underscores the delicate balance between engagement and disengagement that any ruler or citizen must negotiate. If we broaden our lens to include Western thought, we find an unexpected kinship between Lao Tzu's non-domination and Henry David Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience. Thoreau famously declared, "That government is best which governs least," a sentiment that mirrors Lao Tzu's counsel that the best ruler is like the one who does not intervene. Thoreau's act of refusing to pay taxes in protest of slavery and the Mexican-American War was not merely an act of personal conscience. It was a political statement that the state's legitimacy depends on its restraint. Both thinkers, separated by millennia and cultures, converge on the idea that the health of a polity is measured not by the magnitude of its power, but by its capacity to step back and allow individuals to flourish. In contemporary eco-politics, the Taoist principle of low impact has been invoked to argue for governance models that prioritize ecological balance over economic growth. Modern environmental philosophers such as Timothy Morton speak of hyperobjects, vast ecological entities like climate change that exceed human comprehension, and suggest that a humble, non-interventionist stance may be the only viable response. They point to Lao Tzu's admonition that the softest thing in the world overcomes the hardest, as a reminder that gentle, incremental changes, like reducing carbon footprints, preserving wetlands, and fostering community gardens, can outlast the forceful, top-down approaches that often exacerbate ecological crises. The Taoist ethic of simplicity thus becomes a guiding principle for policies that aim to reduce consumption, promote renewable energy, and rewild urban spaces. Let us now examine a concrete modern example that illustrates this synthesis. In the city of Copenhagen, the municipal government adopted a Copenhagen climate plan that emphasizes low-impact living and urban simplicity. Rather than imposing strict mandates, the city provides incentives for cyclists, subsidizes rooftop gardens, and designs public spaces that encourage spontaneous community interaction. The plan's architects often cite Taoist ideas when describing the city's flow and harmony with nature. In practice, this approach has led to a measurable reduction in carbon emissions, a rise in public health, and a sense that citizens are co-creators of their environment rather than passive subjects of top-down regulation. The success of Copenhagen demonstrates that a governance model inspired by Lao Tzu's emptying can, when combined with democratic participation, produce tangible benefits without heavy-handed coercion. A second example can be found in the realm of restorative justice, an emerging alternative to punitive legal systems. Restorative justice programs aim to repair harm by fostering dialogue between victims, offenders, and the community, rather than imposing strict retributive penalties. This method aligns closely with Lao Tzu's principle of non-action in the sense that the state steps back, allowing the relational dynamics to resolve the conflict organically. In New Zealand's Maori-led Te Ao Maori restorative processes, the emphasis is on restoring balance mana rather than asserting authority. Scholars such as John Braithwaite have argued that this approach reduces recidivism and promotes social cohesion, suggesting that a Taoist-inspired soft power can be more effective than the legalist reliance on force. Both examples underscore a key Taoist insight. The most durable forms of order arise not from the imposition of external structures, but from the cultivation of internal harmony. When a ruler or a government creates conditions in which the hearts of the people are emptied of greed and fear, the resulting social fabric is resilient, adaptive, and self-regulating. This does not mean a lack of structure. Rather, it implies a structure that is flexible, responsive, and minimally invasive. To deepen our understanding, we can draw an analogy from the natural world. Consider a forest ecosystem. The tallest trees provide shade, the underbrush thrives in the filtered light, and the soil's nutrient cycles are maintained by the quiet work of fungi and microbes. If a forest manager were to constantly prune the canopy, the ecosystem would become unstable, losing the subtle balance that allows diverse species to coexist. The Taoist ruler is like the forest's invisible mycorrhizal network, present, essential, yet largely unnoticed. By facilitating connections, by quietly nourishing the roots, the network sustains the forest without ever dictating the growth of each individual tree. In the same way, a ruler who empties hearts does not command overtly. Instead, he creates the conditions for virtue to emerge naturally, for humility to take root, and for simplicity to flourish. Historical anecdotes further illuminate this principle. One story from the Warring States period tells of King Gaojian of Yue, who, after being humbled by the state of Wu, famously slept on a board of wood and tasted bitter herbs to remind himself of his past humiliation. His court minister, a Taoist named Fan Lei, advised him to govern by emptiness, urging the king to reduce the extravagance of his court and to focus on the well-being of his people. Gaojian followed this counsel, reduced taxes, and instituted policies that emphasized frugality and agricultural recovery. Within a few years, Yue rose from subjugation to become a dominant power, illustrating how a ruler's willingness to adopt simplicity and humility can translate into tangible strength. Another anecdote comes from the Tang dynasty poet official Du Fu, who, during the Lushan Rebellion, observed the chaos wrought by excessive military ambition and bureaucratic overreach. In a letter to a fellow scholar, Du Fu wrote, "When the ruler forgets the Tao, the empire collapses like a house of cards." He went on to praise Emperor Daizong's later attempts to restore order by reducing the size of the imperial guard and allowing the people to return to their fields. Du Fu's observations echo Lao Tzu's warning that excess leads to disaster and that the wise ruler reduces his own desires. And the people follow naturally. These narratives, while rooted in specific historical moments, speak to a timeless tension. The desire for order versus the danger of overcontrol. Lao Tzu's political ethics ask us to reconsider the very definition of power. Power, in the Taoist sense, is not the capacity to dominate, but the capacity to create space. It is the ability to hold back, to allow things to be as they are, and to trust that the natural flow of human affairs will align with the larger cosmic order. This perspective reframes the role of the ruler from a commander to a gardener, someone who clears the weeds of greed and ambition, waters the seedlings of humility, and steps aside to let the garden grow. Yet, as the modern critics remind us, such a vision can be dangerously idealistic if taken at face value. In societies where wealth disparity is vast, where corporate interests wield disproportionate influence, a ruler who empties hearts may find his policies co-opted by those who can afford to maintain their own comforts while the masses bear the brunt of austerity. The danger is that the rhetoric of non-action becomes a veil for neglect, allowing systemic injustices to persist unchallenged. This is why contemporary scholars stress the importance of coupling Taoist humility with institutional safeguards, transparent accountability, participatory decision-making, and a vibrant civil society to ensure that emptying does not become a tool for erasing dissent. In the realm of political theory, the synthesis of Lao Tzu's insights with democratic norms has given rise to what some scholars call Taoist liberalism. This strand, articulated by thinkers such as Robert A. Dahl and more recently by the Chinese political philosopher Wang Hui, argues that the virtues of simplicity and humility can inform a liberal democratic project that values limited government, decentralization, and citizen autonomy. They contend that the Taoist emphasis on Wu Wei does not preclude active civic engagement, Rather, it encourages citizens to act in ways that are harmonious with the community's needs, avoiding the hubris of imposing one's will through coercive legislation. In this view, the emptying is a collective process, a shared commitment to reduce the excesses of power, both at the level of the state and within individual aspirations. Returning to the historical case of Emperor Wen, we see an early incarnation of this principle. Wen's reduction of taxes and his encouragement of agrarian simplicity were not merely acts of benevolence. They were strategic moves to prevent the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few elite families. By keeping the economic base broad and the fiscal burden light, Wen ensured that the state remained dependent on the goodwill of the populace, rather than on the coercive extraction of resources. This approach mirrors modern progressive taxation policies that aim to distribute wealth more equitably while preserving the social contract. The Tang dynasty's later embrace of Taoist-inspired policies, especially under Emperor Chunzong's quiet governance reforms, can be seen as an early experiment in what we might now call soft power governance. By limiting the scope of imperial edicts, promoting local autonomy, and encouraging cultural practices that celebrated simplicity, such as the tea ceremony and poetry gatherings, the Tang court created a cultural milieu where the state's authority was felt less as a heavy hand and more as a gentle breeze guiding the sails of civilization. The result was a period of artistic flourishing and social stability that many historians attribute in part to this Taoist-inflected approach. Contrast this with the legalist ruler Qin Shi Huang, whose empire-building relied on massive public works, strict legal codes, and relentless surveillance. While his unification of China was undeniably effective in the short term, the harshness of his policies led to widespread rebellion after his death, culminating in the restoration of Han rule under a more Confucian legalist hybrid. The legalist emphasis on coercion, in stark opposition to Lao Tzu's non-action, demonstrates the fragility of regimes that rely on force rather than on the cultivation of a harmonious social order. Even within Confucianism, we find a nuanced dialogue with Taoist political thought. The Confucian classic Mencius records a conversation where Mencius asks the ruler, "If you love the people, why do you not lower taxes?" The answer given by the ruler is, "I must maintain the rights and the grandeur of the court." This exchange highlights the Confucian focus on ritual and hierarchy, whereas Lao Tzu would counsel the ruler to let go of the rights, for they become burdens when they are not needed. The tension between these two philosophies has shaped Chinese political discourse for centuries, with each offering a different prescription for how a ruler should relate to his subjects. In the modern West, the influence of Lao Tzu's political ethics can be traced through the environmental movement's emphasis on low-impact living and the rise of degrowth economics. Scholars such as Serge Latouche argue that perpetual economic expansion is unsustainable, and that societies must embrace a voluntary simplicity akin to the Taoist ideal of returning to the root. This line of thought resonates with Lao Tzu's warning that the more one possesses, the more one is bound. By advocating for policies that reduce consumption, promote communal sharing, and prioritize well-being over GDP growth, modern eco-politics operationalize the Taoist ethic of simplicity in the public sphere. To bring these threads together, let us consider an analogy from music. A masterful pianist does not press every key with force. Instead, she allows the melody to breathe, letting silences shape the piece as much as notes. The pauses, the rests, the spaces between sounds create tension, release, and emotional depth. In the same way, a ruler who practices wu-wei does not fill every moment with decree. He leaves room for the people to think, to act, to find their own rhythm. The music of a well-governed society is not a relentless march, but a flowing composition where each instrument, citizen, institution, environment contributes its voice in harmony. Yet we must also heed the cautionary tale of the silent ruler who becomes a puppet master behind the scenes. History offers the example of the Qin dynasty's first emperor's successor, Qin Shi, who, under the influence of the eunuch Zhao Gao, pretended to rule while allowing Zhao Gao to manipulate state affairs. The veneer of non-intervention masked a ruthless consolidation of power, leading to chaos and eventual collapse. This illustrates that the Taoist ideal can be subverted when emptiness is used as a cover for hidden authority. Transparency, accountability, and a culture of civic virtue are essential safeguards to prevent such perversions. In the realm of contemporary political practice, the concept of deliberative democracy offers a promising avenue for integrating Lao Tzu's ethics with modern governance. Deliberative democracy emphasizes inclusive, reasoned discussion among citizens, aiming to reach consensus through mutual understanding rather than through majority rule or elite decision-making. This process mirrors the Taoist principle of non-contention, the idea that the most effective outcomes arise when participants refrain from imposing their will and instead listen to the natural flow of collective reasoning. By fostering spaces where dialogue can occur without coercion, deliberative institutions embody the Taoist vision of a ruler who empties his mind to be receptive to the voices of the people. Let us now turn to the practical implications for policymakers today. If a government wishes to adopt a Taoist-inspired approach, it might begin by simplifying tax codes, reducing bureaucratic layers, and empowering local municipalities with greater decision-making authority. It could also promote cultural programs that encourage citizens to engage in contemplative practices, meditation, poetry, calligraphy, activities that cultivate humility and inner simplicity. By aligning public policy with the cultivation of inner virtues, the state acknowledges that external order is inseparable from the internal state of its citizens. Moreover, in foreign policy, a Taoist perspective would advise restraint and humility. Rather than projecting power through military interventions, a Taoist-informed strategy would focus on building mutual understanding, supporting grassroots development, and respecting the autonomy of other nations. This approach resonates with the contemporary soft power doctrine, where influence is exercised through culture, ideas, and economic partnerships rather than through coercion. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, with their emphasis on partnership, equity, and environmental stewardship, can be seen as a global articulation of the Taoist principle that the best way to lead is to be invisible. In sum, Lao Tzu's political ethics invite us to reimagine the role of the ruler, the nature of authority, and the pathways to a just society. By emphasizing simplicity, humility, and the politics of non-domination, he offers a counter-narrative to both the Confucian meritocratic ideal that foregrounds active moral instruction and the legalist doctrine that foregrounds coercive control. The historical case studies of Emperor Wen of Han and the Tang dynasty's Taoist-inspired reforms demonstrate that these ideas are not merely abstract musings, but have concrete, measurable impacts when put into practice. The modern critiques, whether labeling Lao Tzu's vision as utopian or warning of its potential misuse, serve as essential checks, reminding us that any political philosophy must be grounded in mechanisms that protect against abuse. The lives of Tao Yunaming, the writings of Thoreau, and the emergence of eco-politics illustrate how the Taoist ethic continues to reverberate across cultures and centuries, offering tools for individuals and societies to navigate the complexities of power with grace. As we reflect on the Taoist political ideal, we might ask ourselves, in a world saturated with information, competition, and relentless acceleration, can we afford a governance model that values emptying hearts and returning to simplicity? Perhaps the answer lies not in abandoning all structures, but in rebalancing them, allowing space for humility to flourish, for simplicity to guide policy, and for the subtle, invisible forces of compassion and restraint to shape the destiny of nations. In the words of Lao Tzu, when the great Tao is forgotten, kindness and morality arise. When kindness and morality are forgotten, law and order arise. When law and order are forgotten, chaos reigns. May we heed this ancient warning, and may our societies learn to govern not by force, but by the quiet, enduring power of the empty vessel that holds the world's deepest potential. The Tao of the Way has always been described as something that cannot be grasped by the mind, something that slips through the fingers of language as water slips through a sieve. In the opening verses of the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu tells us, the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. This paradoxical opening is not a mere literary flourish. It is the gateway into a metaphysical landscape where the unnameable origin, the dance of yin and yang, and the perpetual cycle of change form the backbone of Taoist cosmology. As we wander through this terrain, we will hear the murmurs of ancient sages, the rustle of bamboo leaves, and the steady rush of a river through the seasons, each echoing the same underlying principle. That reality is a flowing, interdependent process rather than a collection of static things. To begin, let us linger on the notion of the unnameable. Lao Tzu's insistence that the ultimate principle cannot be captured by words is mirrored in the opening of the Yijing, the Book of Changes, where the text states, "The supreme ultimate is nameless, the 10,000 things have names." Both texts point to a source that is beyond conceptualization, a kind of primordial ground from which all distinctions arise and to which they eventually return. In the Tao Te Ching, this source is called the Tao, while in the Yijing it is often referred to as the Teji, the great ultimate. The similarity is not accidental. Taoist thinkers later incorporated the Yijing's hexagram system as a map of how the unnamable Tao expresses itself through patterns of change. The Yijing organizes reality into 64 hexagrams, each composed of 6 lines that are either solid yang or broken yin. These configurations are not static symbols. They are dynamic models that illustrate how yin and yang combine, separate, and transform. When Lao Tzu speaks of the Tao as the mother of the 10,000 things, he is describing the same generative principle that the Yijing encodes in its hexagrams. For example, hexagram 1 consists of 3 unbroken yang lines and represents the creative, active principle, while hexagram 2, with 3 broken yin lines, stands for the receptive, yielding principle. The movement from one hexagram to another, the shifting of a single line from yin to yang or vice versa, captures the perpetual flux that Lao Tzu calls the constant transformation of the 10,000 things. But how does this abstract interplay of lines translate into the lived world? The answer lies in the doctrine of yin and yang itself, which is more than a symbolic dualism. It is a description of the relational qualities that permeate every phenomenon. Yin is often associated with darkness, stillness, receptivity, and the interior, while yang corresponds to light, activity, expansion, and the exterior. Yet these qualities are not oppositional in a rigid sense. They are complementary, each containing the seed of the other. The Tao Te Ching captures this subtlety in verse 42. The Tao gives birth to one, one gives birth to two, two gives birth to three, and three gives birth to the 10,000 things. Here one is the Tao, two are yin and yang, three is the interaction of the two that produces the myriad forms, and the 10,000 things are all the diverse phenomena we encounter. To illustrate this interaction, imagine a river winding its way through a valley. In spring, the meltwater swells the river, the flow becomes vigorous, the surface churns, and the current pushes against the banks. This is the yang aspect, forceful, outward, expanding. As summer deepens, the sun's heat draws water upward, the river's surface becomes calm, reflecting the sky, and the surrounding foliage shades the water, tempering its vigor. Here yin and yang are in balance, the river both moves and mirrors. Come autumn, the river's flow recedes, the water becomes clearer, the banks reveal stones and sediments, and the river's depth contracts. This is a subtle shift toward yin, a withdrawal of excess energy. In winter, the river may freeze, its surface becoming solid, its inner current slowing to a near standstill. Yet even in this apparent stillness, the water beneath the ice continues a slow, hidden flow, an undercurrent of yang that will soon melt away, giving rise again to spring's vigor. The river's seasonal cycle embodies the yin-yang dance. Each phase contains the seed of its opposite, each transformation is a natural response to the unnamable Tao that governs the whole. A second, equally vivid illustration comes from the life cycle of a bamboo forest. When a bamboo shoot first emerges from the earth, it is a tender, green spear, fragile and dependent on the moisture of the soil, an embodiment of yin, receptive and yielding. As it grows, it stretches upward, its joints expanding, its leaves unfurling to catch the sun. This upward thrust is the yang aspect, the expression of growth and expansion. Yet bamboo is also known for its flexibility. When a storm bends the stalks, they do not break but sway, storing the force and releasing it gently when the wind subsides. This resilience is a synthesis of yin and yang. The ability to receive and absorb yin while also projecting strength outward, yang. When the bamboo matures, it begins to produce shoots in the following spring, sending out new life from the base. The old stalk, having fulfilled its role, may die and decompose, enriching the soil for the next generation. The cycle of birth, growth, bending, and renewal mirrors the Taoist vision of perpetual change, where each stage contains the seed of the next and nothing remains fixed. These natural patterns are not isolated curiosities. They are the living proof of the Taoist claim that the universe is a seamless web of interdependent processes. In the Tao Te Ching verse 73, Lao Tzu writes, "He who knows the subtlety of the Tao is able to be at one with it, and therefore he is able to make all things follow his will without force." This subtlety is precisely the awareness of how yin and yang interlace, how the unnamable origin manifests through the 5 phases: wood, fire, earth, metal, water, each phase representing a stage in the transformation of energy. The 5 phases or wuxing are not separate elements but stages in a cyclical process. Wood feeds fire, fire creates earth ash, earth bears metal, metal collects water, and water nourishes wood. Each transition involves a shift from yin to yang or vice versa, a continual rebalancing that keeps the cosmos in dynamic equilibrium. When we compare the 5 phases to the hexagrams of the Yijing, we find a striking correspondence. The hexagram for wood, for instance, is wind, which is composed of a yang line above a yin line, symbolizing the upward movement of growth that is still rooted in the earth. Fire, represented by fire, shows a central yang line flanked by yin lines, indicating the bright, rising energy that is still contained within a broader context. The Yijing's emphasis on transformation through the change of a single line mirrors the Wuxing's idea that each phase can give rise to the next by a subtle shift. This alignment underscores how Taoist metaphysics is not a random assortment of symbols, but a coherent system that maps the flow of the unnamable Tao onto observable patterns. Yet this elegant metaphysical tapestry has not escaped criticism. Rationalist philosophers, especially those rooted in the Western analytic tradition, have often dismissed Taoist metaphysics as vague, arguing that the reliance on paradox and the refusal to define the Tao leaves the system open to relativism. They ask, if the Tao cannot be named, how can we claim any knowledge about it? How can we differentiate meaningful insight from mere poetic fancy? In response, Taoist scholars point to the pragmatic nature of the teachings. Lao Tzu does not demand a precise definition because the Tao is not a static object to be categorized. It is a process, a flow. The very act of trying to fix it in language would be to miss its essence, just as trying to capture a river in a jar would destroy its nature. Moreover, the Taoist emphasis on aligning oneself with the patterns of change, through non-action wu-yi, simplicity and humility, offers a practical methodology that can be tested in daily life. When a ruler governs by non-interference, allowing the natural order to unfold, the state experiences stability. When a leader forces policies against the grain, chaos ensues. This experiential verification, though not scientific in the modern sense, provides a form of empirical feedback within the Taoist framework. A second, more contemporary critique comes from the scientific community, which often regards the yin-yang theory as lacking empirical support. Critics argue that categorizing phenomena as yin or yang imposes a dualistic framework that does not correspond to measurable variables, and that the 5 phases are no more than metaphorical labels for cycles that could be explained by physics, chemistry, and biology without recourse to metaphysical principles. To address this, modern scholars have turned to systems theory and complexity science, which reveal striking parallels with Taoist thought. In systems theory, the concepts of feedback loops, attractors, and emergent behavior echo the Taoist insight that the whole is more than the sum of its parts, and that stability arises from the balanced interaction of opposing forces. The yin-yang symbol itself can be seen as a visual representation of a dynamic equilibrium, a system that maintains stability through the continuous exchange of energy between complementary components. In ecological modeling, for example, predator-prey dynamics follow a cyclical pattern reminiscent of the yin-yang oscillation. When prey populations rise, predators flourish, yang, which then reduces prey numbers, leading to a decline in predators, yin, and the cycle repeats. Such models provide a quantitative backbone to the ancient intuition that change is constant and that opposites are interdependent. To further illustrate the modern relevance, consider the field of cybernetics, pioneered by Norbert Wiener, which studies control and communication in animals and machines. Wiener described feedback as the circular causal chain that maintains system stability, a concept that resonates with the Taoist notion of returning to the root. When a thermostat detects a temperature deviation, it triggers a response that brings the system back to equilibrium, much like how the Taoist sage observes the natural tendency of the world to seek balance between yin and yang. The parallels are not coincidental. They reveal that the Taoist metaphysical insights, though expressed in poetic language, anticipate patterns that contemporary science now quantifies. Let us now turn to some of the legendary narratives that have helped shape the Taoist worldview. One of the most famous anecdotes involves the Yellow Emperor Huangdi, a mythic ruler traditionally dated to the 3rd millennium BCE. According to the Shiji and later Taoist texts, Huangdi once ventured into the western mountains, where he encountered an old man with a long white beard, carrying a sack of bamboo. This old man claimed to be a hermit who had retreated from the world to contemplate the Tao. When Huangdi asked for the secret of good governance, the hermit replied, "Do not intervene. Let the people follow the Tao of nature." The emperor, impressed, invited the hermit to his court, only to find that the hermit had vanished, leaving behind a single bamboo shoot that grew into a towering grove. The story serves as a metaphor for the Taoist principle of non-action. Just as the hermit disappears yet leaves a lasting imprint, the wise ruler governs by creating conditions that allow the natural order to flourish without overt coercion. This anecdote also ties back to our bamboo example, reinforcing the idea that true influence is subtle, rooted in the unnameable Tao rather than in forceful edicts. Another comparative myth that enriches our understanding is the Chinese creation story of Pangu, a giant being who separated heaven and earth with an axe, standing between them for 18,000 years. As Pangu breathed, his body transformed. His breath became wind, his voice thunder, his eyes the sun and moon, his limbs the four cardinal directions, his blood rivers, his flesh the earth, his hair the stars. When Pangu finally died, his body gave rise to all things. While the Pangu myth seems at odds with the Taoist emphasis on the unnameable, it actually complements it by illustrating the transition from a chaotic, undifferentiated whole to a differentiated cosmos. The Taoist perspective would view Pangu's act of separation not as a divine command, but as the natural unfolding of the Tao's potential, a movement from the undivided source, the unnameable, into the duality of yin and yang, and subsequently into the manifold forms of the world. In this sense, the myth serves as an allegory for the Taoist process of differentiation and return. Cross-referencing with Western philosophy, we find a striking resonance with Heraclitus of Ephesus, who famously declared, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it is not the same river and he is not the same man." Heraclitus's doctrine of perpetual flux mirrors Lao Tzu's emphasis on change, yet the two differ in tone. Heraclitus focuses on the tension of opposites. Fire is the primary element that both creates and destroys, whereas Lao Tzu emphasizes the harmonious balance that arises from the interpenetration of opposites. Both, however, reject static being in favor of becoming. When we read Heraclitus alongside the Tao Te Ching verse 2, when people see some things as beautiful, other things become ugly. When they see some things as good, other things become bad, we see a shared insight. Value judgments arise from relational contrast, not from intrinsic properties. This relational thinking is central to the yin-yang model, where the meaning of yin is defined only in relation to yang, and vice versa. Modern systems theory further extends this dialogue. In the study of complex adaptive systems, scholars such as Stuart Kauffman describe how order emerges from the interaction of simple rules, a process that resembles the Taoist view of the 10,000 things emerging from the interplay of yin and yang. The concept of edge of chaos, a state where a system is neither too rigid nor too random, can be likened to the Taoist ideal of the middle way, the sweet spot where the forces of yin and yang are in dynamic equilibrium. In this context, the Taoist metaphor of the unnameable source becomes a useful heuristic for describing the attractor state toward which complex systems gravitate, a state that is not a fixed point, but a basin of possibilities shaped by continuous feedback. Returning to the river and bamboo examples, we can see how these natural systems embody the principles of feedback and self-organization. A river's flow adjusts to the terrain, sediment load, and seasonal precipitation, constantly recalibrating its channel through erosion and deposition. This self-regulation is a form of negative feedback. When the river's velocity increases, erosion deepens the channel, which in turn reduces velocity, restoring balance. Similarly, a bamboo forest regulates its own microclimate. The dense canopy shades the soil, reducing evaporation, while the roots stabilize the ground, preventing landslides during heavy rains. The forest's growth cycle, with its periodic mass flowering and dieback, can be viewed as a positive feedback loop that ensures genetic diversity and ecological resilience. Both examples illustrate how the Taoist principle of non-intervention aligns with modern ecological management. By allowing natural feedback mechanisms to operate, we sustain the health of the system. Let us now examine the 5 phases more closely, because they provide a concrete framework for understanding how change unfolds across different domains. The first phase, wood, is associated with growth, flexibility, and the spring season. In human terms, wood corresponds to the stage of learning and development, when the mind is open, receptive, and ready to absorb new ideas. The second phase, fire, represents expansion, transformation, and the summer heat. Fire is the stage of action, where the energy cultivated in the wood phase is expressed outwardly, much like a scholar who, after years of study, begins to teach and share knowledge. The third phase, earth, is the stabilizing center, the late summer or early autumn that brings harvest and nourishment. Earth signifies the consolidation of achievements, the moment when ideas take root in society. The fourth phase, metal, denotes contraction, refinement, and the autumnal shedding of excess. Metal is the stage of critique and purification, where the scholar refines theories, discarding what no longer serves the truth. Finally, water, the fifth phase, embodies winter, introspection, and the return to the source. Water is the phase of contemplation, where the mind turns inward, preparing for the next cycle of growth. Each phase contains within it the seed of the next, a subtle transformation that can be represented by the change of a single line in a hexagram. When a yin line turns yang, wood becomes fire. When a yang line turns yin, fire becomes earth, and so on. This cyclical logic underscores the Taoist conviction that change is not random, but follows an ordered pattern rooted in the unnameable Tao. In the Tao Te Ching verse 64, Lao Tzu advises, "A journey of 1,000 li starts beneath one's feet." This simple admonition captures the essence of the five-phase process. Each step, each small transformation, contributes to the larger flow. It also reminds us that the Taoist path is not about grand, sudden revelations, but about attentive participation in the ongoing dance of yin and yang. When we observe a bamboo shoot pushing through the soil, we witness the wood phase in action. When the shoot unfurls its leaves and captures sunlight, it moves into fire. When the stalk strengthens and stores nutrients, it enters earth. When the stalk reaches maturity and begins to bear fruit or flowers, it transitions to metal. And when the old stalk decays, returning nutrients to the earth, water flows back into the cycle. This seamless progression illustrates how the Taoist metaphysics is not an abstract theory, but a lived reality that can be seen in the most ordinary of natural processes. Let us now entertain the rationalist objection more directly. Critics claim that the Taoist reliance on paradox undermines logical consistency. They argue that if the Tao cannot be known, then any claim about it is self-contradictory. Yet paradox has a long tradition in philosophical discourse as a tool for breaking the limits of conventional reasoning. In Zen Buddhism, for instance, koans such as "what is the sound of one hand clapping" serve to jolt the mind out of discursive thought. Similarly, Lao Tzu's paradoxes are not logical fallacies, but invitations to experience reality beyond the confines of binary categorization. By refusing to pin down the Tao, Lao Tzu keeps the mind open to the fluidity of experience, preventing the ossification of concepts that would otherwise become obstacles to insight. Moreover, the practical outcomes of Taoist practice, greater harmony, reduced conflict, increased resilience, provide an empirical test of the philosophy's validity, even if the test does not conform to the strict standards of formal logic. The scientific objection, that yin-yang lacks empirical basis, can be addressed by recognizing that Taoist metaphysics operates on a different epistemic scale than modern physics. While a physicist might model the motion of particles with differential equations, a Taoist would describe the same phenomena in terms of relational qualities and patterns of transformation. The two approaches are complementary rather than mutually exclusive. For instance, quantum mechanics reveals that particles exist in superposition, a state that can be seen as a literal embodiment of yin-yang duality. A particle can be both wave and particle until measured, at which point it collapses into one aspect. The concept of complementarity, introduced by Niels Bohr, resonates with the Taoist insight that opposites are mutually interdependent and that the whole cannot be understood by isolating one side alone. In this way, modern science, far from disproving yin-yang, often uncovers phenomena that echo its ancient intuition. To further ground these ideas, consider the example of climate regulation. The Earth's climate system is a massive, complex network of feedback loops involving the atmosphere, oceans, biosphere, and cryosphere. Positive feedbacks, such as the albedo effect where melting ice reduces reflectivity and accelerates warming, can be likened to an unchecked yang surge. Negative feedbacks, such as increased cloud cover reflecting sunlight, act as yin, tempering the system. The balance between these forces determines the stability of the climate, much as the Taoist sage seeks balance between yin and yang to maintain harmony. When human activity amplifies the yang side through greenhouse gas emissions, this equilibrium is disturbed, leading to climate change. The Taoist response would be to restore balance by reducing excess, cultivating restraint, and aligning policies with the natural cycles of the five phases, for instance by promoting regenerative agriculture, earth, and renewable energy, fire transformed into a sustainable form. This modern application demonstrates how Taoist metaphysics can inform contemporary ethical and environmental decision-making. In the realm of personal development, the Taoist emphasis on aligning with the unnameable flow offers a roadmap for navigating the inevitable changes of life. When we face a career transition, we might be tempted to force a particular outcome, embodying a rigid yang approach that resists the natural timing of change. The Taoist counsel would be to observe the situation with humility, to recognize the signs of shifting yin, and to adjust our actions accordingly, perhaps by learning new skills, wood, exploring opportunities, fire, consolidating experience, earth, refining goals, metal, and finally reflecting on our purpose, water. By moving through the five phases consciously, we harmonize our inner rhythm with the external world, reducing friction and fostering a sense of ease. Let us now revisit the ancient anecdotes to see how they illuminate these modern applications. The The Yellow Emperor's encounter with the hermit teaches us that true authority does not stem from imposing will, but from creating conditions that allow the natural order to emerge. In modern organizational theory, this translates to servant leadership, where managers empower employees, trusting that the collective will self-organize toward the common goal. The Pangu myth, with its imagery of separation and differentiation, reminds us that creation involves both division and integration. In contemporary science, the concept of symmetry breaking, where a uniform field gives rise to distinct particles, mirrors Pangu's act of separating heaven and earth. The process of symmetry breaking is essential for the emergence of complexity, just as the Taoist process of differentiation from the unnameable source gives rise to the 10,000 things. Cross-referencing again with Heraclitus, we find that both traditions appreciate the role of tension in generating change. Heraclitus's notion of the logos, the rational principle that underlies the flux, can be compared to the Tao, the underlying way that orders transformation. While Heraclitus emphasizes rational comprehension, Lao Tzu emphasizes intuitive alignment. Both, however, converge on the insight that the world is not static but a river of becoming. When we place these ideas side by side, we see a dialogue across cultures that enriches our understanding of change. The rational analysis of patterns, Heraclitus, complements the experiential attunement to flow, Lao Tzu. In the final analysis, the metaphysical architecture of Daoism, its unnameable origin, the yin-yang interplay, and the cyclical phases, offers a comprehensive vision of reality that bridges the poetic and the scientific, the ancient and the modern. By contemplating the verses of the Tao Te Ching, by tracing the patterns of the Yijing's hexagrams, by observing the river's seasonal dance and the bamboo forest's resilient growth, we encounter a living philosophy that speaks to the heart of existence. The rationalist critique reminds us to sharpen our concepts, while the scientific objection challenges us to test the ideas against observable phenomena. Yet both critiques, when engaged with thoughtfully, become opportunities to deepen the Taoist insight, to translate its poetic symbols into the language of systems, to apply its wisdom to governance, ecology, and personal development. As we close this segment, consider the words of Lao Tzu in verse 56, "He who knows does not speak, he who speaks does not know." In the calm of a river at dusk, where the water reflects the fading light, there is a silence that holds the whole of the Tao. In that silence, the yin and yang continue their endless dance. The 5 phases turn inexorably, and the unnameable source remains the quiet wellspring from which all change flows. May we, like the bamboo, bend with the wind, and like the river, find our course by listening to the subtle currents that guide us toward harmony. The story of Lao Tzu's philosophy is often told as a tale of ancient mist and distant mountains, but the currents it set in motion still ripple through the concrete of our modern world. When we hear the word Tao, we may picture a scroll of calligraphy, a quiet garden, or the soft rustle of bamboo in a windless courtyard. Yet today those same principles are being rehearsed in the open plan offices of tech startups, whispered in the design meetings of architects who are trying to build houses that breathe, and echoed in the chants of activists who claim that the very earth itself is a living Tao. In this segment, we will trace how the ancient insight of Wu Wei, or effortless action, has been reimagined as a guiding heuristic for agile project management, how the Taoist reverence for natural cycles informs the emerging field of sustainable architecture, particularly the Earth ship movement, and how Western interpreters such as Alan Watts and D.T. Suzuki carried these ideas across oceans, shaping the way we think about mindfulness, ecology, and even technology design. We will also confront the uncomfortable questions that arise when a tradition as profound as Daoism is packaged for consumer markets, and when its more radical, politically charged roots are softened into a gentle spirituality. Throughout, we will draw lines to Buddhist concepts of interdependence and to contemporary philosophers like Bruno Latour, whose work on the politics of nature resonates with Taoist thought in unexpected ways. Let us begin with a simple image, a river flowing through a valley. It does not push against the rocks, it does not force its way. It simply follows the path that the landscape offers, carving a channel over centuries, shaping the terrain as much as it is shaped by it. Lao Tzu writes in Chapter 8 of the Tao Te Ching, "Water is fluid, soft, and yielding, but water will wear away stone." Later in Chapter 64 he says, "A man who follows the Tao is like water, which benefits all things and does not contend." These lines are not merely poetic. They are a practical guide to how one might engage with the world without exhausting it. The principle of Wu Wei, often translated as non-action, but more accurately understood as action without forced effort, asks us to align our movements with the natural flow, to act in harmony rather than in opposition. In the world of software development, this ancient wisdom has found a surprisingly precise echo. The Agile movement, which rose to prominence in the early 2000s, emphasizes iterative development, responsiveness to change, and a collaborative ethos that seeks to minimize waste. Within Agile circles, a growing number of teams have begun to speak of Wu Wei as a cultural principle. The story goes back to a small startup in San Francisco in 2011, where the engineering lead, after reading a translation of the Tao Te Ching recommended by a colleague, began to ask his team, what would water do? The answer, he suggested, was to let the sprint backlog flow naturally, to avoid overspecifying tasks that would later become obstacles. The team started to practice what they called effortless sprints. Rather than micromanaging each ticket, they set a clear intention for the sprint, much like a river's direction, and then allowed the developers to find the paths of least resistance, to refactor on the fly, to let emergent solutions surface. One concrete example of this approach is the practice of no-meeting days that many Agile teams have adopted. By designating certain days as free from scheduled meetings, the team creates a space where work can progress without the friction of constant interruptions, much like a river that can move unimpeded when the banks are smooth. In the words of the team's Scrum Master, when we stop trying to control every ripple, we allow the current to carry us forward. The result, according to their internal metrics, was a measurable increase in velocity and a reduction in burnout. The metaphor extends further. Just as water seeks the lowest point, Agile teams practicing Wu Wei seek the simplest solution, the path of least resistance, rather than imposing complex architectures that require constant maintenance. Critics, however, warn against romanticizing Wu Wei as a management hack. Some scholars argue that the term has been stripped of its ethical dimension, reduced to a productivity tool. In the original Taoist context, Wu Wei is inseparable from humility, compassion, and a deep respect for the natural order. It is not merely a technique for efficiency, but a moral stance that acknowledges the limits of human control. When we extract the concept for corporate use, we risk losing that depth, turning a profound philosophical insight into a buzzword. This tension mirrors a broader debate about the commercialization of Daoism, a theme we will return to later. Turning from software to stone, the principles of Daoism have also guided a new wave of sustainable architecture, most visibly in the Earth-ship movement. Earth-ships are off-grid homes built from natural and recycled materials, designed to be self-sufficient in energy, water, and waste. The name itself evokes a vessel that carries its inhabitants through the currents of nature, rather than battling against them. The founder of the movement, architect Michael Reynolds, has repeatedly cited Taoist ideas as a philosophical backbone for his designs. In a 2015 interview, Reynolds described his approach. I try to listen to the land to let the house be a response to the climate, the soil, the wind, just as Lao Tzu says, nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished. An earthship typically incorporates thick, rammed earth walls that act as thermal mass, a greenhouse that captures solar heat, and a water harvesting system that channels rain into cisterns. The building's orientation is determined by the sun's path, the prevailing winds, and the slope of the land. In this way, the structure does not dominate its environment, it integrates with it, much like a bamboo grove that bends with the wind yet remains rooted. The design philosophy also embraces the Taoist concept of Zuren, naturalness, or spontaneity, by allowing the house to adapt over time. For instance, the interior partitions can be reconfigured as the needs of the occupants change, and the composting toilets evolve with the community's waste streams. The result is a dwelling that, rather than imposing a rigid order, participates in a dynamic relationship with its surroundings. One vivid anecdote illustrates this relationship. In 2019, a group of volunteers built an earth ship in the arid outskirts of Lanzhou, China, as part of a pilot project funded by a local university. The site was a barren plateau with little water and harsh winds. The design team, inspired by the Taoist principle that the soft overcomes the hard, opted for a low-profile, earth-covered structure that would blend into the landscape and reduce wind resistance. They installed a series of wind catchers, tall, slender shafts that channel breezes into the interior, providing natural ventilation. The result was a home that remained cool in summer and retained heat in winter, all without a single mechanical system. The residents described the experience as living inside the Tao, noting how the house seemed to breathe with them. This story not only demonstrates the practical application of Taoist thought, but also shows how ancient wisdom can inform cutting-edge ecological solutions. The rise of such projects is part of a broader Chinese ecological movement that explicitly invokes the Tao. In the early 2020s, a grassroots coalition of scholars, artists, and activists launched the Tao of the Forest initiative, aiming to protect old-growth woodlands in the Sichuan Basin. Their manifesto opens with a quotation from the Tao Te Ching, The forest is a living embodiment of the Tao. It thrives without striving, yet sustains all within its shade. The movement's tactics are deliberately non-confrontational. Instead of staging protests, they organize silent walks through the forest, encouraging participants to attune their senses to the subtle rhythms of wind, water, and wildlife. They also promote Taoist reforestation, a method that mimics natural succession by planting a diversity of native species in patterns that reflect the forest's own self-organizing processes. This approach contrasts sharply with top-down, engineered afforestation schemes that often prioritize fast-growing monocultures. By framing ecological stewardship as a practice of wu-wei, allowing the forest to heal itself, the movement underscores the political potency of Taoist thought when it is reclaimed from purely spiritual or aesthetic domains. The resonance of Daoism in contemporary mindfulness practices is perhaps the most widely recognized. When we sit in meditation, focusing on the breath, we are often told to let go and to observe thoughts without attachment. This instruction mirrors the Taoist counsel to be like water, which does not cling to the shape of a cup. In the Zhuangzi, a later Taoist text, we read the famous story of the butterfly dream. Zhuangzhou dreamed he was a butterfly when he woke. He did not know whether he was Zhuangzhou who had dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming that he was Zhuangzhou. This paradox invites us to dissolve rigid self-identities, a practice that modern mindfulness teachers have embraced. Alan Watts, the British philosopher who popularized Eastern ideas in the West during the 1960s, often spoke of this fluidity. In a 1966 lecture, he declared, "You are the universe experiencing itself. To realize that is to be at peace with the flow of the Tao." Watts's charismatic delivery made these ancient concepts accessible to a generation yearning for spiritual depth beyond the confines of organized religion. His influence can be traced directly to the development of mindful flow techniques used in sports psychology, where athletes are coached to enter a state of effortless performance, a modern embodiment of wu-wei in action. Another Western conduit for Taoist thought was D.T. Suzuki, a Japanese scholar who spent decades translating and interpreting Zen and Taoist texts for English-speaking audiences. In the 1950s, Suzuki taught a series of seminars at Columbia University, where he introduced students to the Tao Te Ching alongside the Heart Sutra. He emphasized the complementarity of Taoist naturalness and Buddhist emptiness, noting that both traditions point toward a reality beyond conceptual grasp. One of his most quoted passages reads, "The Tao is not a thing. It is a way of being that is as much about the world as it is about the self." Suzuki's articulation of Taoism as a lived practice rather than a static doctrine helped pave the way for the integration of Taoist principles into contemporary environmental ethics, a field that now often cites his work when discussing the moral imperative to live in accordance with natural cycles. Yet as Taoism spreads through mindfulness apps, corporate training modules, and eco-design curricula, a counter-current emerges, warning that the tradition is being diluted. Critics argue that the commercialization of Taoist symbols, such as jade pendants stamped with the yin-yang, or yoga studios offering Taoist breathing classes for a premium, reduces a profound philosophical system to a marketable aesthetic. In a 2018 essay, scholar Livia Cohn writes, "When Taoism is packaged as a lifestyle brand, its radical critique of power structures is obscured, and its capacity to inspire social transformation is compromised." The concern is that the original Taoist challenge to hierarchical authority, exemplified by the early Taoist movement's opposition to the Qin dynasty's legalist rigidity, gets softened into a gentle call for personal tranquility. This critique resonates with a broader debate about the spiritualization of political movements. Historically, Taoism was not merely a contemplative path, it was also a source of social critique and even rebellion. During the late Han Dynasty, the Yellow Turban Rebellion, 184 CE, was driven in part by Taoist millenarian ideas that promised a return to a harmonious age under the guidance of the Tao. The rebels proclaimed, "The heavens have turned against the tyrants, the Tao will restore balance." Their uprising, though ultimately suppressed, demonstrates that Taoist thought has a radical edge capable of challenging entrenched power. When contemporary interpretations focus exclusively on inner peace, they risk erasing this transformative potential. To deepen our understanding, we can turn to Buddhist philosophy, which shares with Taoism a vision of interdependence. The Buddhist principle of pratityasamutpada, or dependent origination, teaches that all phenomena arise in dependence upon multiple causes and conditions. This resonates with the Taoist view that the Tao is the underlying process that gives rise to the myriad forms of the world. In modern environmental ethics, scholars like Thomas Berry have invoked both traditions to argue for a planetary consciousness that recognizes the web of life. Bruno Latour, a French philosopher and anthropologist, extends this conversation in his seminal work We Have Never Been Modern, where he argues that nature and society are inseparably entangled, a politics of nature that demands new forms of governance. Latour's concept of collective actors mirrors the Taoist notion that the self is not an isolated entity, but part of a larger, flowing system. He writes, we must think of the earth as a network of actors, each influencing the other without a clear hierarchy. This perspective dovetails with the Taoist ethic of humility before the larger currents, reinforcing the idea that responsible action, whether in technology design, architecture, or activism, requires listening to the relational forces at play. Let us pause for a moment and consider an analogy that brings these threads together. Imagine a symphony orchestra. Each musician holds a distinct instrument, each with its own voice, yet the conductor does not dominate the performance. Instead, the conductor guides the ensemble to listen to one another, allowing the music to emerge organically. In Taoist terms, the conductor embodies Wu Wei. They intervene just enough to shape the flow, but they do not force the violins to play louder than the cellos. The resulting harmony is not the product of a single will, but the co-creation of many parts responding to each other. This image captures how modern applications of Daoism, whether in agile teams, sustainable buildings, or ecological movements, function best when they foster responsiveness, humility, and a respect for the interdependent whole. Returning to agile project management, we can see how Wu Wei informs not only the avoidance of micromanagement, but also the cultivation of a learning culture. In a 2020 case study of a multinational software firm, the product owner introduced a practice called the river meeting. At the end of each sprint, the team gathered around a whiteboard that depicted a flowing river. Participants placed sticky notes representing tasks, challenges, and insights along the river's path, noting where the flow had been smooth and where it had encountered rocks. The visual metaphor encouraged the team to reflect on the natural obstacles that emerged, to adjust their processes accordingly, and to celebrate moments where the work moved effortlessly. Over a year, the team reported a 30% reduction in defect rates and an increased sense of collective ownership. The river meeting, in essence, operationalized Wu Wei as a reflective practice that aligns human intention with the emergent dynamics of the project. In the realm of sustainable architecture, the principle of Zuren, the naturalness that arises without artificial imposition, has inspired designers to look beyond mere energy efficiency toward regenerative design. Earthship homes, for example, often incorporate thermal chimneys that use the stack effect to draw warm air upward, creating natural ventilation without fans. This design mirrors the Taoist insight that the softest thing in the universe overcomes the hardest. By allowing heat to rise naturally, the building reduces the need for mechanical cooling, thereby conserving resources. Moreover, the use of reclaimed materials, old tires, glass bottles, discarded aluminum, embodies the Taoist ethic of Wu Wei in material culture. Rather than forcing the market to produce new resources, designers work with what is already present, letting waste become a resource. The result is a built environment that participates in a cycle of transformation, echoing the Taoist belief that all things are born of the Tao and return to the Tao. The modern ecological movement in China that invokes the Tao provides a compelling illustration of how Taoist ideas can be mobilized for collective action. In 2021, a coalition of rural communities in the Yunnan province organized a Taoist river restoration project. The river, historically a lifeline for agriculture, had been polluted by upstream mining operations. Rather than demanding top-down governmental intervention, the communities adopted a Taoist-inspired strategy. They began by cleaning the riverbanks using traditional bamboo baskets, planting native riparian vegetation to stabilize the banks, and establishing a communal monitoring system where elders recorded water quality using simple, low-tech tools. Their guiding principle, taken from chapter 33 of the Tao Te Ching, was, "He who knows others is wise, he who knows himself is enlightened, he who conquers others has force. He who conquers himself is truly strong." By focusing on self-cultivation, learning to live in harmony with the river, they gradually influenced upstream stakeholders, who eventually agreed to adopt cleaner mining practices after seeing the tangible benefits of a healthier watershed. The project was celebrated not only for its environmental impact, but also for its demonstration that Taoist philosophy can underpin a pragmatic, community-driven approach to ecological stewardship. Yet the same movement has faced criticism from scholars who argue that invoking the Tao can sometimes serve as a rhetorical shield, allowing participants to avoid confronting deeper structural injustices. Some analysts contend that by framing environmental action as a return to natural order, activists may inadvertently legitimize existing power hierarchies that dictate land use. This critique mirrors the broader concern that spiritualized Daoism can dilute its radical edge, turning a tradition of dissent into a gentle call for personal adjustment. In response, some activists have emphasized the political dimension of Daoism by recalling its historical role in challenging authority, as in the case of the Yellow Turban Rebellion. They argue that the Tao's emphasis on spontaneity, zuren, can inspire collective improvisation, a willingness to reorganize social structures in response to emergent ecological crises rather than merely adapting to them. When we examine the cross-cultural transmission of Taoist ideas, the contributions of Alan Watts and D.T. Suzuki become pivotal. Watts, with his distinctive blend of humor and depth, introduced Western audiences to the paradoxical logic of the Tao. In a 1970 interview, he remarked, "The Tao is like a finger pointing at the moon. If you stare at the finger, you miss the moon." This metaphor captures the Taoist warning against clinging to symbols rather than experiencing the underlying reality. Watts's influence can be seen in the rise of mindful walking practices, where participants move slowly through natural settings, attuning their steps to the terrain, a physical enactment of Wu Wei that bridges philosophy and embodied experience. D.T. Suzuki, meanwhile, provided a scholarly rigor that grounded Taoist concepts within a broader philosophical context. His translations of the Tao Te Ching emphasized the text's poetic ambiguity, inviting readers to sit with uncertainty. In a 1957 lecture, Suzuki declared, "The Tao is not a doctrine to be mastered. It is a way of being that unfolds as we let go of our pretensions." This insight has informed contemporary environmental ethics, where scholars argue that the humility inherent in Taoist thought is essential for addressing the Anthropocene's complex challenges. By acknowledging that human agency is limited and that we are part of a larger ecological tapestry, we open space for collaborative, adaptive governance models, precisely the kind of political imagination that Bruno Latour advocates. Latour's notion of politics of nature proposes that we treat non-human actors, rivers, forests, climate systems, as participants in political deliberation. This idea finds a natural ally in Daoism, which refuses to draw a hard line between the human and the non-human. In chapter 25 of the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu writes, "There is a time for being ahead and a time for being behind. The wise are those who know when to act and when to be still." This passage can be read as an early articulation of what Latour calls the collective agency of nature. By recognizing that ecosystems possess their own agency, we are compelled to design policies and technologies that respect, rather than dominate, natural processes. The agile Wu Wei mindset, when extended beyond software teams to governmental institutions, suggests a form of governance that is responsive, adaptive, and humble, qualities that are urgently needed in climate negotiations. Let us now explore two concrete, contemporary examples that illustrate how these philosophical currents converge in practice. The first is the development of digital minimalism platforms that aim to reduce cognitive overload by aligning user interfaces with natural attentional rhythms. One startup, Calmtech, designed an app that monitors a user's heart rate variability and, based on real-time data, gently nudges the individual to pause, breathe, or switch tasks, much like a river's current adjusts to obstacles. The design team cites the Tao Te Ching as their guiding text, particularly the line, "When the great Tao is present, the world is at peace. When it is absent, the world is in turmoil." By embedding Wu Wei into the software's feedback loops, the app encourages users to act effortlessly, reducing the friction caused by constant notifications. Early studies report that participants using the app experience lower stress levels and higher productivity, suggesting that technology, when informed by Taoist principles, can become a conduit for harmonious living rather than a source of dissonance. The second example lies in the realm of urban planning, where a city in the Netherlands, Groningen, has adopted a Taoist district model for a new residential area. Planners consulted with Taoist scholars and environmental psychologists to design streets that meander rather than run in straight lines, allowing traffic to flow at a pace that encourages walking and cycling. Green corridors are interspersed throughout the neighborhood, creating micro-habitats that support biodiversity. Water management systems mimic natural wetlands, filtering runoff through reed beds before it re-enters the municipal water supply. The district's name, Daohu, translates to lotus pond, evoking the image of a flower that rises unblemished from muddy waters, a symbol of purity emerging from complexity. Residents report a heightened sense of place and community cohesion, attributing it to the design's emphasis on living with the land rather than over the land. This project exemplifies how Taoist concepts can be scaled up from individual homes to entire urban ecosystems, fostering a built environment that aligns with the rhythms of nature. In reflecting upon these diverse applications, we see a pattern. Taoist ideas are most potent when they are not merely quoted, but embodied in concrete practices that respect the relational nature of reality. Whether it is a software team allowing code to evolve organically, an architect letting a building breathe with the wind, or an activist community nurturing a river's health, the underlying thread is the recognition that forceful control often leads to resistance, whereas gentle alignment invites cooperation. This insight is echoed in Buddhist philosophy as well. The Mahayana Sutra Vimalakirti tells of a bodhisattva who, like a skilled gardener, prunes without harming the plant, allowing it to flourish. The convergence of Taoist wu-wei and Buddhist emptiness points toward a shared ethical horizon, a world where actions are guided by an awareness of interdependence and a humility before the larger currents that shape existence. Nevertheless, we must remain vigilant about the pitfalls that accompany the popularization of any tradition. The commercialization of Daoism, through merchandise, wellness retreats, and corporate slogans, risks reducing a sophisticated worldview to a set of feel-good platitudes. As the philosopher Eva Wong observes, when the Tao becomes a brand, its transformative power is domesticated, its capacity to challenge the status quo is neutralized. This concern invites us to ask, how can we honor the depth of Lao Tzu's teachings while making them accessible to a broader audience? One answer lies in education that foregrounds both the mystical and the political dimensions of Taoism, ensuring that learners encounter the tradition's historical moments of descent alongside its contemplative practices. To conclude, the resonance of Lao Tzu's philosophy in contemporary mindfulness, ecology, and modern thought is not a coincidence, but a testament to the timeless relevance of the Tao. The principle of wu-wei offers a framework for action that is both efficient and compassionate, guiding agile teams to avoid the tyranny of over-control, and inspiring architects to design habitats that work with, rather than against, natural forces. Western interpreters like Alan Watts and D.T. Suzuki have acted as bridges, translating the subtle paradoxes of Taoism into languages that speak to the modern psyche. At the same time, movements in China that invoke the Tao to protect forests and rivers demonstrate how ancient ideas can energize concrete ecological activism. Yet, the journey is not without obstacles. The commercialization of Taoism and the softening of its radical edge remind us that every appropriation carries the risk of loss. By engaging with Buddhist interdependence and the insights of thinkers like Bruno Latour, we can deepen our understanding of the entangled web that binds humanity, technology, and the natural world. In the end, perhaps the most faithful way to honor Lao Tzu is to embody his counsel. The highest good is like water. It benefits all things and does not compete. May we in our workplaces, our homes, and our communities strive to become that water, flowing, adaptable, and quietly powerful, so that the Tao, ancient and ever new, continues to shape the world not through force, but through the effortless grace of wu-wei.